Hello, everyone, and welcome to another episode of this Revolution podcast. I know you're used to me hosting our non-soccer sports program here, Beyond the Red Zone, but today we're switching it up a bit. But I do want to add that I'm so glad you're here for our returning listener subscribers, and especially our patrons. Hell yeah! Last night, we had maybe one of the most insane situations ever. I don't even want to say it on air for fear that the master control program is listening and will once again nuke the show. But you guys are the driving force behind the TIR machine, and we couldn't do this without you. For those new to the channel, welcome. If you enjoy this type of programming, please hit like and subscribe. It is a passive gesture that goes a long way in promoting the channel. Also, for viewers of the main show, we will be back tomorrow, and I'll be interviewing Catherine Liu live and in person at UC Irvine. We'll be discussing the Scarface movies and gangster capitalism. Make sure to tune into that one. It will be a little earlier. I think we'll be going live around 1 p.m. Pacific time. Quick reminder that TIR is listener-funded programming. If you enjoy watching all these shows and have the means and feel so inclined, become a patron. You can access champagne rooms past and present, join us for our patron-only call-in segments, and something we've been doing a lot more lately, movie nights. Like we did Tuesday night. We watched Scarface, the 1983 version. That was an interesting viewing. But today, I have some of the TIR crew to discuss the big, beautiful bill, the devil in the details. There are a few people in modern history who have failed upward, with such consistency, and turned that failure into one of the most recognizable brands built on lies, smug bravado, and the ability to sell middling comedy as everyman wisdom. Donald Trump, after a disastrous first term in office, was voted out in 2020, but he has since used that familiar skill set to repackage himself, capturing the public's short attention span and re-entering office with a more focused agenda and a cabinet stacked with loyalists. We now stand on the edge of what is his administration calling the big, beautiful bill. Behind that hyperbolic name lies the further erosion of social services and massive tax breaks for the wealthy. While the bill promotes the no tax on tips provision as a victory for workers, the devil is, as always, the details. On the surface, it might sound like good news for the approximately 4 million Americans who work for tips, but there's less to celebrate than it seems. First, many tipped workers already receive a large portion of their income in unreported cash. Second, the federal definition of a tip excludes many common service charges. For instance, an automatic gratuity on a restaurant bill for parties of 5 or more isn't counted as a tip, nor is a room service charge fee at a hotel. So how much does this provision really offer to the working class? Meanwhile, the bill proposes devastating changes to Medicaid, many of which disproportionately harm the most vulnerable. New work requirements for childless adults without disabilities, mandating at least 80 hours of work per month starting in December of 2026, more frequent re-enrollment from annually to every 6 months with additional income and residency verification, cuts to provider taxes used by states to fund Medicaid, potentially crippling rural hospitals. There's a tightened eligibility for able-bodied adults with children over age 15 who must now work or volunteer at least 80 hours per month. According to the Congressional Budget Office, these changes could result in nearly 12 million Americans losing health coverage over the next decade. And that's just the beginning. This insidious piece of legislation deserves deep scrutiny. Today we'll I can't talk today. Today we'll examine how this bill could reshape the social safety net, who really stands to benefit, and what these changes might mean for the economy, deficits, and the lives of everyday Americans. Most importantly, we'll ask, what can we do to fight back? To join me in this discussion, I have my homie, my dog, man of the Mau Mau Hour, the Prince of Miami himself, the Pascal Robert.
Peace and greetings to the chat. Peace and greetings to the audience. Peace and greetings, Jason Miles.
How are you?
Well, all right.
And also coming from his office somewhere deep in a rebuilt Death Star, Deep State Cuba.
Hello. I didn't see you there. The Ewoks will be with you shortly.
Well, what is the real purpose of the big beautiful bill? Is it more neoliberalism draped in MAGA nomenclature, or is this a true ideological shift?
I don't think this is an ideological shift. I think this is an ideological consistency within the branding of the Republican Party, which is wealth distribution upward at the cost of the bottom portion of the American working class. I think that this is in line with a moral consistency with conservative values that basically believe that those who are given the most deserve the most, and those who have the least deserve the least. And that this type of policy is not so much an aberration, but more consistency with the true nature of what conservative philosophy really is. And I'd like to know if Cuba agrees or disagrees.
First of all, I don't think the stream is on, and we should probably address that.
It is. It is.
It is.
Yep.
It is. Is the chat gaslighting me because I disapprove of that kind of role reversal?
I think anyway, YouTube might have pulled it again or something.
I think that for me, there's a lot in this bill which is just reminiscent, just standard operating procedure for conservative administrations. The slashing of the tax burden on wealthiest Americans, actually that having already been accomplished, making those previous administrations tax reductions permanent, classic Republican play. The attack on benefits for working class Americans, also Republican classic, no real news there. What I think the most striking departures, the innovations in this bill, are the funds that are dedicated to what can be described as domestic repression. The 10,000 extra ICE agents, the money for state and local detention centers for migrants, and of course the massive new carceral complex for people in immigration detention across the United States. That represents a departure. That's not quite business as usual. And I think that along with the moves that we've already seen in Trump's second term, it really does represent a amplification, an intensification of the amount of discretionary power in the hands of the presidency for extrajudicial types of repression, detention, arrest, arbitrary measures against political and identity-based opposition groups. There's also the significant increase in military funding as well, which has been targeted in certain areas that some of which is out of necessity. For instance, the munitions and supply chain top-ups represent the reality that the transfer of large amounts of American and NATO stockpiles to Ukraine has depleted American stores. Not only that, but the perpetual adventurism all across the Middle East, likewise, that requires refilling and resupplying American munitions especially. but also we see the Golden Dome concept, which will likely be another boondoggle for the missile defense contractors, together with a mechanism to tie the United States and Israel closer together.
So, contrary to the notion that Doge was supposed to cut back excessive spending in the Pentagon, what you're saying is that the Build Back Better bill, or the big beautiful bill, if you will, is going to be more fat back and biscuits to the military industrial complex, basically. Is that what
Oh,
you're
yes.
saying?
I think that what we're seeing is not just military Keynesianism, the classic American version of industrial policy, but an escalation of the militarization of domestic law enforcement, together with the turning of that militarized capacity more and more on the American civilian population. And this notion that there was any kind of fiscal discipline, any kind of small government component to MAGA, I think we can safely put that to rest after looking at the contents of this bill and the full-throated way in which Donald Trump has owned, supported, and pushed the passage of this bill. What we're seeing is it's resulted in the purge of at least a couple of Republican senators that, um, for reasons of their own, couldn't go along with components inside the bill. The bill was passed with the slimmest margins through the Senate. A number of Republicans voted against it, a small number, but even so, under this very polarized and partisan political environment, that's a notable departure from the standard party line votes. And instead, MAGA is shaping up to be this type of redistributionary movement with certain favored groups, uh, with things like eliminating the tax on tipping and eliminating or rather, increasing the cap for Social Security tax exemption. That's a giveaway to middle class retirees. So Trump, while looking after the wealthy as a class, is also playing tactically with benefits for certain targeted groups within the working class in order to disrupt the ability to have a broad mobilization, especially with the components of the working class that are most likely to vote. Retirees generally have a much higher level of political participation, so they get thrown a little, even as Medicaid recipients have a great deal cut back from them.
Yeah, that's problematic.
How does the marketing of this bill, especially provisions like no tax on tips, obscure its more dangerous elements?
I think that many of the people who will benefit from no tax on tips will also have coworkers in the kitchen, the busboys, the barbacks, that will fall afoul to the 10,000 extra ICE agents and detention centers that are being put up. So you have this notion of, and Jason, as you pointed out, many tipped workers were already enjoying tax-free status simply by virtue of the fact that this is a cash-based business and it's possible to avoid reporting that income to a large extent. So you have what's a very minimal type of benefit, which strictly adheres to the category of tipped workers who report their benefits, who report the tip wages, either because they have to, because they belong to a company that reports for them, etc. they receive a bit of a benefit, but people in the same industry are going to be on the receiving end of severe repression as a result of other components of this bill and other elements of the Trump MAGA policy playbook. It's an excellent way to try to divide up your opponents and to curry just enough favor to potentially get over that 50% plus one magic line coming in 3 to 4 years, which will determine whether or not this governance regime will be entrenched or overturned.
I think it also blurs the consciousness of many people in the working class or working poor who will not be alive to how damaging this bill is to their fellow class comrades, because if they are working for tips and they say they're not on Medicare or they're not on Medicaid, because they're not on Medicaid or they're not having those types of those types of provisions affecting them, they'll be like, "Whoa, Trump is helping the working class. Oh wow, he saved me some tip money in my taxes." Well, meanwhile, God forbid you get sick and you lose your job, and the only way you can get health care is through Medicare. Well, now you're not eligible anymore because the entry level requirement for Medicaid now is so high, it's almost impossible for you to get. You don't realize till it's too late how badly Trump has screwed you over.
And it sets up this notion that there's a real honest working class which reports their tips and which survives on Social Security, and then there are these chiselers, these parasites who have fraud and abused their way onto the Medicaid or disability rolls, losing sight of the fact entirely that if you're one of the people who might benefit otherwise from the bill, the only difference between you and the people who are being punished, the people who are having their benefits slashed, is, like you said, a serious medical condition, an accident, something that pushes you from regular employment into disability. We're not talking about Scandinavia here, where there's a healthy social insurance system and a social safety net for regular people experiencing those types of setbacks. Medicaid was already a difficult system to qualify for, a system which had means testing, which had all kinds of administrative hurdles in order for accessing benefits. And now the benefits available have just been brutally drawn back.
Correct.
Cuba, there is money for ICE in this bill. There's more money for ICE in this bill. What could that mean for what we're already seeing with the administration's Gestapo-like deportation tactics and even Trump's kingly proclamation to deport actual citizens? Tariffs were his last catchphrase, his new "you're fired," if you will. That was massively unpopular to his constituents, as are these deportations. Will the administration use this increase in ICE funding to hire third-party deportation mercenaries like Blackwater goons and bounty hunters?
I think that that's a best case scenario, because third-party contracts can be ended more readily. What I'm anxious about is that this bill calls for 10,000 more regular uniformed ICE agents, people who belong to the Federal Civil Service and Customs Enforcement. So that's 10,000 relatively well-paying, relatively stable, relatively secure, and if you belong to a certain community, if you have a certain political orientation, relatively respectable jobs that can be apportioned, much like the directorship of the FBI, to political loyalists, to the people who are most fervently, most fanatically dedicated to Trump personally. So ICE is bad enough as it is. It's where the most MAGA intensive members of the federal law enforcement community end up. Now, that will be amplified, that will be reinforced with 10,000 people especially selected for that political orientation, that willingness to do anything and everything, and that willful blindness for the niceties of the constitutional limitations. Then those people are going to be hard to get rid of, right? You will have at least 3 or 4 years for them to get promotions, for them to entrench themselves inside the various law enforcement hierarchies, transfer to different departments, maybe move into the FBI, move into other branches of federal law enforcement. If there's a J.D. Vance presidency or a third Trump term, then that means further entrenchment of this personnel until you move from a federal law enforcement service, which was in theory under the last 4 or so presidents, since Richard Nixon, at least, maybe professional, apolitical, right, nominally playing by the book, and right, it was very much a mixed bag in practice, but there were some bright spots to federal prosecution for hate crimes, things of that nature. Now that's going to be unimaginable, right? You're going to have the rather than having a very mixed, to put it in the most charitable possible way, federal law enforcement community with at least a few areas of relative integrity, you will have a uniformly repressive and MAGA aligned apparatus of coercion.
The Senate bill requires there's a Supplemental Nutritional Assistance Program, SNAP, which is used by over 40 million low-income Americans. The Senate bill requires states to contribute more to the program, which is currently fully funded by the federal government. The government would continue to fully fund the benefits for states that have an error payment rate below 6%, but states with higher error rates would be on the hook for anywhere from 5% to 15% of the program's costs. What does that mean for SNAP recipients?
Well, that means that states that, particularly states like in the South, that may be more likely to have error rates, or large municipalities like that where you have huge numbers of users, like states like that have cities like New York City or California, uh, will be more likely to have SNAP benefits laid on the budget for the state than the federal government covering the 100% dole out because of their error rate. So, in other words, if you have an error participation rate of over 6%, you're going to have to cover about 5-6% of your SNAP dole out instead of the federal government normally covering it for itself. So it's going to make it more difficult for states that oftentimes have difficulty managing the budgets of SNAP themselves for whether administrative reasons or otherwise, and it's going to be more costly. So as a result, anytime it becomes more costly, it's going to be more administratively difficult to manage SNAP and have people delegated to receive it in those kind of environments.
And what it will do is it'll provide an incentive for states to have the most punitive and restrictive possible requirements for participation in SNAP. Because if you exclude somebody, that's not an error. The only errors that count are false positives. And those will result in hits to your budget. So from a purely lizard person, McKinsey consultant view, it makes a lot more sense to have the most punitive possible entry requirements so that you run the least risk of having to dip into your own state budget to make up the SNAP layouts. And this is a way, one of them, I remember that 10 or 15 years ago, there was this genre of Malcolm Gladwell style behavioral economics work. Nudge was one of the books. There were some others, all about how you can structure incentives in an invisible way, just within the choice architecture faced by users or people operating a particular bureaucratic system, to steer people in the direction you want, well, without mandating that the system operate in that way. And for a long time, there was a kind of liberal orientation within, liberal in the Hillary Clinton sense of the word, in the way that big bureaucracies operated, with a lot of borrowing from large corporations on the part of democratic administrations and democratic state governments. And now we're seeing inside this bill, in the way that incentives for state governments, incentives for downstream operators are being structured, an architecture that gets them moving in MAGA directions just by pragmatic calculation, without any explicit requirement to, go after the poors or beat up on illegals, right? You're just making it so that it's good business to do what Trump and MAGA would want you to do. The Pascal, I'm curious, what do you think the reaction is going to be for? We talked in previous episodes about the remarkable success that Trump has had with Latino voters, with Black men, with other groups that have traditionally been disproportionately, overwhelmingly supportive of Democratic candidates. Do you think that the substance of this bill may cause a bit of a reversal of those trends, or?
It's a very good question. I think that the answer to that question depends on, quite frankly, how swiftly the pain is felt because of the bill, in terms of when it's passed. If the pain is felt immediately in terms of people losing healthcare coverage or access to SNAP, you're going to start to see people, even within the MAGA kind of poor white working class segments, start to rebel. You're going to start seeing people going to, their congressional district meetings with their representatives, or town halls, complaining about the bill. And it will come out. I think it'll come out in the midterm voting, in terms of what happens in the midterm voting, in terms of people feeling that they were betrayed by Trump. I think it's very possible. Some people are already saying that this bill could cost Trump the midterms with both chambers of Congress. I think he's already lost the House. Let's wait and see if he loses the Senate because of this as well. I mean, that's more of a stretch, but it's not an impossibility.
How much do you think it matters if he loses the midterms?
Let me tell you something. Normally, as you know, Kuba, for a president, losing the midterms can put a kibosh on a large part of their administrative agenda. But because Trump basically governs by fiat with executive orders, I don't see him losing Congress particularly affecting his ability to govern the way he does, because his governance is profoundly undemocratic, intentionally so. He's a strong believer in the the theory
Rule
of
by decree, essentially.
rule by decree, the theory of the executive presidency, so on and so forth. So I don't see how him losing the midterms affects the efficacy by which he's able to govern if he continues to rule by decree in the way that he does.
So if we're also seeing that there's a willingness to arrest and prosecute members of Congress, to manhandle a California senator, not a California state senator, but an actual federal senator from California, for nothing worse than raising his voice at Kirsty Noem during a press conference, which frankly right, feels like a venue where you should be able to do that even without having been elected to the United States Senate.
Right.
Do you think that even with Democratic majorities in Congress and Senate and the Senate, there could be a meaningful check on presidential authority, especially if he gets 10,000 more ICE agents that are personally loyal to him in the way that I had described?
Well, I think with Trump, the cruelty is the point, and he likes to flaunt his power in the face of opposition. He likes to, I mean, Trump is not above the use of authoritarian tactics to get his point across, and I think that he would defy congressional Democrats trying to challenge his authority by whatever means possible to make it seem like he's the ultimate determiner of what goes on in the country. So if that means him locking up congressional, I mean, he's already got a congressman from New Jersey under indictment, I think, for being
assault or something.
Assault under an ICE agent or something like that. So these are rather trying times. I mean, this is not to be taken lightly.
And I think that in a lot of ways, what you're saying, we're already seeing that in California, right? The whole deploying, federalizing the National Guard, sending uniformed troops, U.S. Marines, to go after protesters and migrants. Protesters and frankly brown people, right? They're not really distinguishing who has papers and who doesn't. And the fact that you have pushback from Mayor Bass and Gavin Newsom has only strengthened the resort to force and the defiance of the Trump administration. And what we've seen with the judiciary is, frankly, a damp squib, right? There hasn't been any appetite on the part of the Supreme Court to really pull back some of these executive powers that Trump has been usurping.
Well, you saw the recent decision from the Supreme Court that made it impossible for federal court judges to hand out injunctions to Trump's decisions on birthright citizenship of all things. I mean, that's a major green light for the Trump administration to to go out and just basically, challenge the efficacy of so many years of constitutional jurisprudence under the guise of, challenging birthright citizenship. These are very, very disturbing times, and I don't think anyone should sit back and laxly and think these are normal procedures.
I think that what we've seen in the Democratic opposition, especially the establishment element, like the Schumer, Hakeem Jeffries attitude, is one where you basically sit back and wait for the midterms and expect the electoral system to be the way out of the Trumpian cul-de-sac. But I think that there's a real underestimation. I agree with you that these are unprecedented times, that this is a situation in which we've already seen measures that respectable people thought were inconceivable. So why wouldn't there be more inconceivable measures to come? And assuming that the standard mechanisms for political readjustment, even if Trump substantially loses popularity, loses the midterm elections, is on track to lose the presidential election, why should we assume that that's going to work like it has in the past?
Exactly.
And this is one reason why, and I hate to hearken back to my piece in Jacobin with Ben Burgess, but why I think that the developments around the security apparatus are particularly significant here, because if Trump is going to breach constitutional norms, as he already has done, but if he's going to do so more flagrantly and more consequentially, then you need muscle to carry out your decrees. You can't assume that the regular rules-based apparatus is going to still follow your rules-breaking style of leadership. And for me, the most striking and dangerous part of this bill is the fact that it offers an incredible budgetary pool to strengthen and intensify that security apparatus in exactly the agencies and in exactly the roles that are most dedicated and loyal to Trump. And one story that was reported, but I think has kind of gotten lost in the whirlwind of daily outrages in this second Trump administration, has been the purge of different parts of the military industrial complex and the U.S. federal security apparatus, which, granted, these are not the chat's favorite people, but it can always get worse. And I think that's exactly what's happened. When you look at who was fired from the NSA, fired from the FBI, who has been sidelined at the Department of Defense or removed from the Department of Defense, the cadres most likely to either overtly or surreptitiously oppose and slow walk the constitutional violations intrinsic to the MAGA agenda, well, they're gone. They're fired. They're out on their ass. And now Trump has carte blanche for 10,000 replacements from the, I wouldn't be surprised if he recruits heavily from January 6th pardonees.
I mean, that's frightening to think that he would go back into that well, a well that he condemned at one point in time, a well that I think most Americans feel is where the basket of deplorables lives. What would that say if he did stick his hand back into that grab bag of goodies, if you will?
Well, I think that one thing that I said to a friend of mine who I won't name, but is perhaps not a friend of the show. The type of person who complains about college protesters, who complains about pro-Palestinian groups, who complains about, first and foremost, Antifa, is that if things get really bad, it's Antifa who'll show up to try to push back. Say what you will about the radical, paramilitary elements of the left, and there's a lot to criticize them for. I mean, most of all, they're just so annoying and inefficacious. But a little like the early French resistance to Nazi occupation during World War II, the people who will be overrepresented showing up will be the annoying and stubborn and difficult extremists from the other side. And that's especially true if the purges of the established security apparatus have been effective in removing internal dissidents. One thing that very much troubled me about developments in California was the unwillingness of Gavin Newsom to try to take back the National Guard, right? If a state governor can't keep control, can't keep authority over their own National Guard, that means that the states also won't protect you from federal overreach and the repressiveness of the federal security apparatus. Trump will just federalize your National Guard. And if we look at Governor Newsom's example, you'll have some strongly worded statements in a lawsuit, but that doesn't really change things if they're marching to roll up another 10 square blocks of a major US city. And I think that just as we've seen with previous measures by Trump, these types of moves into police state actions are kind of trial balloons. He's seeing what he can get away with. And the Democrats have shown him that he can get away with virtually everything.
That's very true. And it's very very dispiriting as well.
Well, what does that mean with the Newsom Bass contingent, the resistance liberals, if you will, that are trying to position themselves for a 2028 presidential run? What does it mean in this moment where his resistance, if you will, is just rhetorical only?
It means that the liberals have no real understanding of what they're trying to fight and how to fight it, and that frankly, that Trump is willing to rip to shreds whatever traditional mechanisms we've had in terms of law, order, society, morality, and anything else to stay in power, and that all he respects is power, and the liberals are totally unprepared in terms of how to exercise the use of power to stop him.
Exactly. It's bad. It's one thing. I understand the constitutional observation of democratic rules and norms where you don't want to exercise hard power while you believe that legal order and electoral system can be saved. But you have to at least preserve your capacity to, if things get worse, hold on to some hard power options of your own. And the Democrats don't seem to understand that at all. And I have to say that, especially given the really remarkable unanimity of retired members of the intelligence agencies, retired generals, backing Biden over Trump. Things like the security community letter, things like what turned out to be a factually incorrect collective statement about the Hunter Biden laptop, for instance. It really seemed as though there was a bit of Biden Dem lean in the deep state. But the Democrats have done nothing to try to protect those deep state cadres that carried water for them in 2020. So who is going to protect them if eventually Trump decides that statements contrary, excessively critical of his administration or even membership in the Democratic Party is somehow equivalent to belonging to Tren de Aragua and a one-way ticket to CCOT, right? Which units of is the 101st Airborne, is the 3rd Armored Division, which generals are going to side with the forces against MAGA that want to maintain the Constitution if push comes to shove in that way. And I think that there's a deep-seated resistance to recognizing the reality of the situation, the gravity of the situation, and what's possible to happen next. I don't know what will happen next, right? I'm not suggesting that without some concerted action on the part of the democratic resistance, a consolidation of an anti-democratic MAGA forever regime is inevitable. I don't know. I don't know how things will shake out with the midterms. I don't know if a potential Democratic majority in both houses may or may not operate to try to reestablish some constraints on executive power. Maybe that'll change the behavior of the Supreme Court. Maybe that'll change the behavior of federal agencies. I don't know. All I know is that I don't see the signs of that would suggest that that would be effective. And I think that if the Democratic leadership is really pinning its hopes on that kind of renaissance, on that kind of opposition, then it's a matter of wishful thinking rather than realistic planning and strategy. And notice that they're more than willing to fight dirty and pull out all the stops when you're going against a socialist like Mamadi in New York City, or derailing the presidential campaigns of Bernie Sanders. But when the stakes are actually, I would say, existential for the American constitutional order, all of a sudden, right, like we all have to pin our hopes on the Senate parliamentarian doing the right thing.
No, exactly. They'll crush the left. The liberals will crush the left before they will fight the right. They'll coalesce with the right, but they'll crush the left.
Why do you think that is?
Because they realize that they're ultimately conservative as an ideology. Liberals are not transformative. They don't challenge capitalism. If we realize that to be radical means to challenge capitalism, then they can't be radical because they don't have a problem with capitalism. And they'll work with conservatives to preserve capitalism as much as possible. Because the left is interested in challenging capital, they have to crush it.
I also think that there's a failure of imagination. And you see this too with a lot of the MAGA voters who right now are experiencing the consequences of living under a MAGA administration. You live off of Medicaid disability benefits, and now you're shocked that your beloved Trump president might actually cut your own livelihood. So there's a delusion that bad things can only happen to other people, especially if you're the right skin tone, you have documents, you're a citizen, you imagine yourself belonging to the right identity group. And I think that the leadership class inside the Democratic Party and inside the liberal political sphere more generally, they've been winning for so long. They've been elite for so long that they cannot imagine a situation in which that card gets pulled, in which that status no longer confers on them the type of privilege and oversized voice that they've grown to just associate with the very essence of their personhood. They can't imagine losing. And because they can't imagine losing, they tell themselves every time they lose that this really isn't it, that this isn't the end, that this is just another speed bump, right, on the arc of history bending towards justice. And that, I think, makes them extraordinarily ill-equipped for a decisive moment like this. They're going to realize much too late that vulnerability also applies to them, and that they should have just moved to Canada when they had the chance.
Sorry. We have to get the comedic effect. So we don't think people really want you to have people move to where you live. These proposed, but going back to the big beautiful bill, how do the proposed Medicaid changes reflect a broader conservative strategy to gut social welfare programs?
Well, I think that part of the thing we have to realize is that the conservative agenda since the Great Society has been to split the New Deal Civil Rights Coalition, which has been to destroy the relationship between the civil rights leadership and the coalition that came out of the New Deal. And one of the ways in which they did that was to challenge the racial benefit, the good faith racial gains that have come out of the civil rights era, and also cut back against the government social safety net. And what Trump's big and better bill, if you will, and the Trump administration demonstrates is that two-pronged attempt to go fight the civil rights New Deal coalition by going after communities of color, whether they be immigrant communities of color or Black folk with their wanting to teach African American history in schools, and also go against the social safety net by being willing to cut it through legislation. So it's in line with the same policy that the Republicans have been willing to fight against since the era of Nixon.
The bill is projected to increase the deficit while cutting social programs. How do Republicans justify this contradiction?
Cool. You want to handle that?
Yeah, I mean, I think we might need to find one. I think that part of the MAGA magic formula is that Trump has allowed Republicans to not have to justify anything ever, right? Like, what's the expression? Love means never having to say you're sorry. MAGA means never having to explain yourself. And I think that there's one of the few elite groups that may understand the severity of the situation might be the haute bourgeois, right? The elite capitalists. The tariffs caused massive dislocation in financial markets, and there's an awareness that there will have to be a serious realignment in global supply chains and production networks, and that there will be different sources of profit in the future under this new regime. I think that what we're seeing is right now a kind of period of consideration among different parts of the financial system, different peak financial actors, over whether the real opportunities right now are in the form of collaboration and coordination within a system where having the right political connections may give you access to even more pots of money than in the past, where you might be able to deploy coercive measures against competitors, certainly against any labor elements that might prove problematic, and that the government is willing to just print and borrow money and then hand it to you, the defense contractor, hand it to you, the private security agency, hand it to you, big tech. So there's a lot of goodness, if you belong to this class, to be had in adjusting to the reality of this system. However, all of this deficit spending will imperil the role of the US dollar as the global reserve currency. One thing that the tariff debacle demonstrated is that there are other countries, there are other global actors in the economy. It's not just the United States establishing and defining the rules for international exchange. That there's a willingness to concede more economic leadership to China if it gets away from this instability and insanity coming out of Washington, D.C., and that there is potential for West without the U.S., collaboration between the EU, Canada, partners in the global South, partners elsewhere, that it is not a hopelessly dependent world on the American market. It is painful to move away, but it is possible. And that may more than offset the benefits that come with coordination with a MAGA regime. And so you may also see some peak financial actors starting to move away from the United States, move operations elsewhere, hedge their bets in terms of currency, hedge their bets in terms of investments. That may be a way in which you actually have some pressure start being applied on the Trump administration in a way that bites a lot more than anything that the Democrats have been capable of so far.
Well, we're having some serious technical problems, so we're probably going to cut it right there. Thank you guys for hanging out with us. Thank you, Give Them an Argument, for hosting the show for a while. And
thank you for being our Canada.
Hopefully we won't have these problems tomorrow. And we are out.